Hello, so today we're talking about a book called The Wasp Factory by Iain Banks. This is a really weird book, and it's one that I didn't know a lot about before getting into it. Really, there are three major reasons why I bought this book. Number one, the title was cool. Number two, the cover art I thought was pretty cool. And number three, it seemed to be very polarizing. I felt like I was seeing a lot of reviews that were either 5 stars or 1 star and that sort of thing, where basically people loved or hated this book. And that's even reflected on a lot of the quotes that you read on the back of the book. One quote reads, "Brilliant, irresistible, compelling." Another reads, "A mighty imagination has arrived on the scene, macabre, bizarre, and impossible to put down." Then there's another quote from the Scotsman, "There's nothing to force you, having been warned, to read it, nor do I recommend it." The Wasp Factory is the first novel not only of tremendous promise, but also of achievement, a minor masterpiece perhaps, rubbish from the times, a literary equivalent of the nastiest brand of juvenile delinquency, and then finally, the last quote, "Read if you dare." Whenever I first started reading it, I had a lot of trouble categorizing it. What I mean to say is that The Wasp Factory is a novel that, just judging by the cover and judging by the title alone, and even judging by the first chapter or two, it feels a lot like a horror novel. And then I got further into it, and then I was like, okay, wait, is this actually like a dark comedy and I've been reading it wrong? And then I kept on reading, and I don't feel like that's an apt description of it either. Really, I guess you could just classify this as literary fiction, but really I don't know what else to call it. I mean, the back of the freaking book just says it's fiction, which is true, I hope, because this is a book about a 16-year-old boy named Frank who has killed 3 family members. And aside from that, he's been raised more or less in isolation. The government doesn't know he exists because it was a home birth, and Frank's father was going through some kind of screw the government type phase, and so as a result, they never registered him and never got him whatever the Scottish equivalent of a social security number is, because the book takes place in Scotland. His mother is absent, and so as a result, he was schooled by his father, and so really I guess this book can serve as a warning against homeschooling. I could probably title this video "The Dangers of Homeschooling," and it would probably upset like 1 or 2 people. Because Frank ends up basically becoming a sort of sociopath. He is violent, he kills animals for fun, he tortures them. As I said, he's killed 3 family members. All in all, he's just a nasty character, but I think that you gain some sympathy for him as you read the book, because you realize some of the things that I just told you about how he was raised more or less in isolation. And so Frank is weird, but also it kind of feels like he wasn't ever set up for success. Frank tells stories about his father and how his father lied to him about all kinds of different things. Some were silly, some were just lies about like dumb jokes. But then as you get further into the book, you find out that Frank's father lied to him about quite big things, honestly, some very big things. And Frank's father is weird, and he claims that he can tell how much you've had if you're drinking based on the smell of your farts. And so that's part of the reason I thought this book might be a dark comedy, because it's about a serial killer essentially, but also you have like fart jokes like that. And Frank also has this entire religion going on with the Wasp Factory and various sacrificial poles. Frank has a bag full of dead animal heads that he severed, and he goes and he puts on poles, and basically he uses this wasp factory that he's built for himself as a sort of fortune-telling device. And again, he's more or less isolated from everyone else, and so as a result, he's just a weirdo. He's just really bizarre. And the book is written from the first person, and so you get into his head a little bit, and his lines of thinking are weird and inconsistent a lot of the time, because Frank sees himself at the end of the day as sane. He sees himself as well-adjusted because he doesn't know any better. And he does have a brother, Eric, who was put into a mental institution and escaped and is coming back home. And so that's where a lot of the tension of the book comes from. Frank's older brother, Eric, is slowly making his way back home, and Eric was imprisoned, or not imprisoned, I guess, but he was institutionalized because he was lighting dogs on fire, and he was trying to feed children maggots, and he was doing all these crazy, disgusting things. And so it really is a weird thing, because it's like, okay, you have the protagonist who is kind of a psycho, but then you have his brother who is like seemingly even more of a psycho. And upon reading some of the backstory for the book, it made a little bit more sense to me, because apparently Iain Banks was a struggling science fiction writer who hadn't had anything published. And basically Iain Banks had been working in sci-fi and had written several novels and stories, and they had all been rejected. And so he decided, you know what, I'm going to write a literary piece of fiction. I'm going to write something that's more mainstream, so that way I'll be able to be published and I'll be able to get my science fiction stuff published. And I have 2 big thoughts about this train of thought, funny enough. Number one, this is actually something that's been done before. This was done by Philip K. Dick. Philip K. Dick, I think, is almost undeniably one of the most important science fiction writers of all time. He wrote A Scanner Darkly, and he wrote Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, which is a freaking great book. It's what Blade Runner was based off of. He also wrote U-Book, which is one of my favorites, and The Three Stigmata of Palmer Eldritch, which is one I need to reread, but I think he's a great writer. And Basically, he had the same problem where he was writing science fiction stuff about 20 years before Iain Banks, and he was having trouble getting published, and so he wrote, I think, like 5 literary novels, basically, that were not science fiction and were mainstream. And to my knowledge, I think only one of them got published, which was Confessions of a Crap Artist, which I think is a pretty good book. I think it's pretty solid. And I think there are definitely parallels between that one and The Wasp Factory, because both of them have weird protagonists, and both books feature more mentions of like aliens and spaceships and weird science fiction stuff like that the further you get on. So like in Confessions of a Crap Artist, for instance, I think the main character joins like a UFO support group or something like that. I forget exactly how it goes, but basically Confessions of a Crap Artist is more interested in alien stuff within the context of the real world. And so my first thought basically is that it makes sense that a science fiction author like Iain Banks would try to write something more mainstream in an attempt to get published, because again, it worked and it had been done before. And then my second thought on the matter is, are you freaking kidding me? This is mainstream? Again, it is more literary fiction. There's not anything too crazy about it. It's not too fantastical, but it's freaking gross. As I've mentioned before, it features this weird kid who's doing weird stuff, who's murdering animals. There's a lot of animal cruelty in it. And there were several parts where I was reading this book where I thought I was gonna have to put it down because it was just so disgusting. There's a scene early on in like the second chapter, I think it is, where he just massacres all of these bunnies. And it was really just disgusting and screwed up, and I didn't like it. And I didn't like the way it made me feel. And I kept on reading the book basically because I knew that if I didn't keep on reading it, if I like actually put it down, then I knew that I would just come back to it. Like I knew that curiosity would get the better of me. But it's also funny because I was reading this book at the same time that I was rereading some of Garth Ennis's Punisher Max stuff. And Punisher Max is a freaking brilliant series, but it's the same thing as this, where it's just really gross at sometimes. And I think in this book, there's a lot of stuff that is dark, and then there's stuff that's meant to be more darkly funny, and it's the same thing with Punisher Max. It's just a question of whether or not you want to laugh at the funny stuff. For my part, I found a lot of the Wasp Factory to just be really sad, but there were a couple moments where I was like, okay, this is pretty good. So for instance, Frank sees the killing of 3 family members as just a phase that he was going through, which is kind of a funny idea, but then what's funnier is the way that he kills his family members, because they're kind of absurd. The first family member he kills is a cousin, and I believe the cousin killed his and his brother Eric's pet rabbits, and so he wanted to get revenge on this cousin, and so the cousin ended up losing a leg somehow, and so Frank captured a snake and put it in his fake prosthetic leg, and then the snake bit the cousin and killed him, blah blah blah. There's death number 1. Death number 2 actually cracked me up because I imagined it, don't judge me, I imagined it like a freaking Looney Tunes cartoon. Basically, Frank had a brother, and they were walking around the town. I think it was after a flood that washed up a bunch of crap, and they were able to find a bomb in the sand that was pointing straight up. And so Frank didn't have any real reason for wanting his younger kid brother to die, but he just felt like he needed to get him out of the picture. Again, Frank is crazy. And so what he says to the younger brother is he says that the bomb is actually a bell, and he tells the younger brother to hit the bomb, but only whenever Frank gives him the signal, whenever Frank is out of range. And so Frank runs a long ways off, and then he gives the younger brother the symbol, and then the brother starts hitting the bomb with a stick on the side, which of course does not trigger the bomb. And then Frank's like, oh no, I screwed up. I was gonna kill my brother here, but like, I didn't give him the right instructions, which was really it was really just kind of stupid, and it cracked me up because I was like, this is dumb. And then of course the younger brother ends up hitting the bomb on the top, and then it explodes and the younger brother dies. And like I said, I was kind of imagining it as like Looney Tunes almost. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, this is freaking stupid, dude. Like this is nonsense. And then the third way that he kills a family member is basically it's his younger cousin, and he has her fly a giant kite basically, and the wind picks up and just carries her off into the sea. And again, these feel like cartoon deaths. They just feel stupid. And so whenever people say that this is the literary equivalent of the nastiest brand of juvenile delinquency, or they say it's rubbish, I think there's some truth to that. And I think the same thing could be said, as I was saying, about Punisher Max, which I've been reading, because I tend to think that with a lot of these works that are darker or grosser or feature dark comedy, I think that with a lot of stuff, I think that with books that are similar to this one, I would group this book in with like A Clockwork Orange or American Psycho. And I think Lolita probably fits in there, though it's less of a comedy and just more because of the unreliable narrator aspect, which this book also has. I think that in any of these works, I think that in anything that embraces the dark side, or anything that tries to be gross or focuses just on mature or disturbing themes, I always think of the quote that art is there to disturb the comfortable and comfort the disturbed. And as I've said before, I am one of the disturbed. And so there's a lot of stuff that I find really comforting that a lot of other people find gross. There's a lot of horror stuff that falls into that category, but also just messing around in horror, just reading horror stuff or horror adjacent stuff. And I think it's fair to call this book horror adjacent. Just kind of floating around in these areas, I think that it's to be expected that you'll stumble upon some things that maybe cross the line too far in your own view of things. And as I'm saying, I feel like parts of this book are really gross. I could do without the animal abuse, honestly, and I could do with like a toning down of the violence. But I do think this book is really interesting just because it's a look at an isolated mind. And as I mentioned, Iain Banks was a science fiction writer, and so that's how he approached this book, because he just saw Frank as something alien or something foreign. And so that's why Frank acts so weird and why he has his own like magic processes going on, his own religion, essentially. If you look up the Wikipedia page on this book, then it refers to Frank's belief, his belief system, as shamanistic, but I don't really know that much about shamans, and so I was just thinking of like magic with a K, and I don't really know that much about like chaos magic or anything like that, or divination, or I guess tarot cards kind of fit in there. But that's how he uses a lot of these random things that he's come up with. That's how he uses the sacrificial poles that he puts dead animal heads on. That's how he uses the Wasp factory, wherein he inserts a wasp and it decides to go to a death of some kind, and then using that death as information, Frank interprets that in a certain way and thinks that certain things will happen based on the way the wasp died. And so Frank was written to be like a more alien character. But as I was saying, I think the best art disturbs the comfortable and comforts the disturbed, and I don't know that you can have one without the other, honestly, because I feel like it both comforted me and disturbed me, because Frank is able to come up with some really astute observations, but at the same time he is a serial killer. There are a few conversations in the book about insanity and what exactly it means to be insane, and I think Frank more or less just kind of agrees that everyone is insane to some degree, but I don't know if that's a good view of things coming from a serial killer. And I think the more you read of the book, the more clear it becomes that it's not meant to be something that's just there to be gross, but rather I think that it is actually kind of focused on some important issues. I think it questions what exactly masculinity means. I think it is one of those books, but I think it's kind of, that's a question that's kind of hidden below the surface to a certain extent. Because I think that the further you get into the book, the more it becomes clear that the reason Frank is doing these things, the reason why Frank is killing people or committing atrocities against animals, or why he just has this crazy belief system, it's all an attempt to be masculine and to be a man. And as I was saying in the beginning, it feels like Frank was not set up for success. He has a father who is a liar. He grew up without a mother because apparently she just ran off. And really he is just kind of isolated. I saw where someone made a connection between this book and The Stranger, and they said that The Stranger is a book about a man who, even though he exists in society, he is isolated mentally and emotionally, or at the very least he seems emotionally stunted. And then The Wasp Factory is a more extreme version of that because it is someone who is isolated completely. And I think it asks an interesting question: what would happen to you if you were just completely isolated and cut off from everyone, and if you hadn't grown up in a society? As I was saying, this book reminds me somewhat of a more gorier, violent, disgusting version of Confessions of a Crap Artist, but it also reminds me a lot of the book Child of God by Cormac McCarthy. I think that one's really strong, and I think it's also underrated in his bibliography. And all in all, I would say that this is a hard book to recommend because it is so gross, it is so disgusting, it is so violent, but at the same time, I would say that I enjoyed it in the end. I don't think it has the same literary merit as something like Lolita, or like A Clockwork Orange, but I still think the book is asking some interesting questions, and I think it's focused on some interesting issues, even if on the face value of things it does seem like rubbish, or the literary equivalent of juvenile delinquency or whatever. And so this is what I got, so thank you for watching, have a nice night, and goodbye.